There are moments when the carefully constructed order of an entire world shifts on its axis, balanced precariously on the edge of a single heartbeat, a single choice, a single movement that changes everything that comes after. In the grand arena of Blackridge Keep, beneath ancient stone arches that had witnessed 1,000 such moments over centuries of Lycan rule, such a moment crystallized around two figures who should never have been equal, yet found themselves locked in confrontation that would reshape the very foundations of their society. The Blackridge pack had flourished for 300 years under rigid hierarchies that kept alphas at the apex of power, betas in comfortable middle positions of authority and service, and omegas relegated to the margins where they could serve without threatening the natural order that sustained their civilization. It was a system that had proven effective through generations of challenges, wars, and political upheavals that had tested but never broken the fundamental assumption that strength determined worth and submission guaranteed survival. In this world of predetermined destinies and unchangeable roles, Neera Vale existed as most omegas did, quietly, carefully, invisibly. She moved through the pack's social structures like shadow through sunlight, present but unnoticed, contributing through service while never drawing attention that might invite correction for stepping beyond prescribed boundaries. To those few who bothered to observe her at all, she appeared perfectly ordinary. Small in stature, modest in demeanor, unremarkable in every way that mattered to people whose values emphasized power, aggression, and dominance as the highest virtues. But beneath her carefully cultivated appearance of harmless compliance lay secrets that would have shattered the pack's sense of security if their true nature had been suspected. Neera Vale was not what she appeared to be. More dangerous still, she was not who she appeared to be. The quiet omega who served without complaint and endured without protest carried within her knowledge and capabilities that belonged to a bloodline the Lycans believed they had extinguished 20 years earlier. A bloodline whose very existence represented a threat to everything the current royal family had built their power upon. The confrontation that was about to unfold would expose those secrets in ways that no amount of careful planning could have prevented. When pride met fury, when arrogance encountered precision, when the heir to absolute power struck someone he assumed would absorb his violence without response, the collision would reveal truths that would force everyone present to reconsider their most basic assumptions about strength, weakness, and the true distribution of power within their carefully ordered society. Prince Riven Blackmore had been raised to understand that his birthright guaranteed him deference from every member of the pack, regardless of their personal feelings about his character or conduct. Neera Vale had been trained to understand that survival sometimes required revealing exactly how dangerous mercy could be when it was mistaken for helplessness. When those two understandings met in violent contact, the resulting explosion would either destroy one of them entirely, or transform them both in ways that neither the prince nor the omega could predict or control. The arena held its breath, suspended between what had always been and what was about to become. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The morning of the autumn trials dawned with the crisp clarity that marked the season when young wolves proved their worth before the entire pack, their performances determining not just individual standing but family honor, mating prospects, and career opportunities that would shape their entire adult lives. The massive stone arena at the heart of Blackridge Keep had been prepared with ceremonial attention to detail that reflected the importance of rituals that connected current generations to centuries of tradition and pack identity. Neera Vale moved among the preparation areas with the near invisibility that came naturally to omegas, who had learned to anticipate needs before they were expressed and fulfill duties before they were assigned. Her hands arranged equipment with practiced efficiency, while her attention remained carefully divided between immediate tasks and awareness of social dynamics that could shift without warning from benign to dangerous, for someone whose position provided no protection against the whims of those who held real authority. The trials themselves would showcase combat skills, leadership potential, and strategic thinking through competitions that had evolved over generations to test capabilities that pack survival might demand during crises that threatened their territorial integrity or social cohesion. Young wolves competed not just against each other but against standards established by legendary figures whose accomplishments had defined excellence within their culture. But for the pack's omegas, the trials represented different challenges. They were expected to observe respectfully, serve efficiently, and demonstrate through their conduct that they understood their place within hierarchies, that their very presence was meant to support, rather than question. It was performance of deference rather than display of capability, though the consequences for failure could be equally severe. "Omega," came a sharp voice that made Naira's shoulders tense despite her conscious effort to remain relaxed and attentive. She turned to find Lady Cassandra Blackmore approaching with the predatory grace that marked alphas who enjoyed exercising authority over those who couldn't resist their commands. "The ceremonial weapons require immediate cleaning and proper arrangement. See that it's done correctly." "Of course, my lady," Naira replied with precisely calibrated respectfulness that acknowledged Lady Cassandra's authority, while avoiding any tone that might be interpreted as sarcastic or insufficiently deferential. "I'll attend to it immediately. See that you do. Prince Riven will be competing today, and any inadequacy in preparation will reflect poorly on everyone responsible for supporting the royal family's participation in sacred traditions." The warning carried implications that extended beyond mere job performance to suggestions about loyalty, competence, and worthiness to serve in proximity to the pack's most important members. Lady Cassandra's attention lingered just long enough to make clear that Naira's response was being evaluated for signs of attitude requiring correction. "Understood, my lady. I won't disappoint the royal family's expectations." "No," Lady Cassandra replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You won't." As the prince's aunt moved away to oversee other preparations that required supervision by someone whose authority ensured compliance, Naira released breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and turned toward the weapons storage area where ceremonial blades waited for attention that would ensure their readiness for ritual use. But her movement was interrupted by collision with someone whose attention had apparently been focused elsewhere, sending both of them stumbling as training equipment scattered across stone floors with noise that drew unwanted attention from pack members whose duties involved maintaining order during important ceremonies. "Watch where you're going, Omega," came a voice edged with irritation that immediately identified the speaker before Naira could look up to confirm her recognition. Prince Riven Blackmore stood before her with expression that mixed annoyance at the disruption with barely concealed disdain for having his morning complicated by someone whose existence he clearly considered an inconvenience. "My apologies, Your Highness," Naira said quickly, dropping to gather scattered equipment while keeping her gaze appropriately lowered to avoid direct eye contact that might be interpreted as challenge to his authority. "I should have been more careful." "Yes, you should have been. Do you have any idea how important today is? How many people have worked to ensure that everything proceeds without embarrassing incidents that reflect poorly on our pack's reputation for competence and organization?" The questions were rhetorical, designed to emphasize her failure rather than elicit actual responses, though Prince Riven's tone suggested he expected acknowledgement of the criticism embedded in his observations. "Yes, Your Highness. I understand the importance of the trials and my responsibility to ensure that nothing I do interferes with their successful completion. Do you? Because from where I stand, it appears that you understand very little about appropriate behavior for someone in your position." Something in his tone made Naira look up, despite protocols that discouraged direct eye contact between Omegas and royal family members. What she saw in Prince Riven's expression wasn't just annoyance at minor inconvenience, but genuine contempt for her very existence, as if her presence in his environment represented personal affront that demanded response beyond simple correction. "Your Highness, I sincerely apologize for any disruption I've caused. It won't happen again, won't it? Because I've noticed a pattern of carelessness from Omegas who seem to believe that their service gives them permission to move through pack spaces as if they belong anywhere other than the margins where they can't interfere with important activities." The accusation was unfair and untrue, though Naira recognized that accuracy mattered less than the prince's perception of disrespect that required addressing through methods that would reinforce appropriate boundaries between their social positions. "Your Highness, I've always endeavored to fulfill my duties without causing disruption or inconvenience to pack leadership. If my conduct has fallen short of expectations, I welcome guidance about how to better serve the pack's interests." "Guidance?" Prince Riven's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from other pack members who had begun to notice the exchange with interest that suggested they anticipated entertainment rather than simple administrative correction. "You think what you need is guidance?" "Yes, Your Highness. Whatever would help me serve more effectively." "What you need," Prince Riven said with deliberate emphasis that made clear his words were intended for the growing audience as much as for Naira herself, "is to understand that carelessness has consequences. That disrupting preparations for sacred ceremonies, because you can't be bothered to pay attention to your surroundings, represents disrespect for traditions that are more important than your convenience. The characterization transformed minor accident into deliberate defiance, creating justification for response that would demonstrate royal authority while providing object lesson for other Omegas who might be tempted to show insufficient care in their service roles. Your Highness, I assure you that my collision with you was entirely accidental. I would never deliberately disrupt preparations for the trials or show disrespect for pact traditions. Assure me? Prince Riven stepped closer. His physical presence meant to emphasize the power differential that made her assurances irrelevant compared to his interpretation of events. You're going to assure me? Do you understand what that implies about the relative importance of your perspective versus mine? The logical trap was elegant and inescapable. Agreeing that her perspective mattered enough to provide assurance suggested inappropriate equality, while admitting that her perspective didn't matter validated his right to ignore her protestations of innocence in favor of whatever interpretation served his purposes. I meant no disrespect, Your Highness. No disrespect, Prince Riven repeated, with tone that transformed her words into evidence of exactly the attitude he was criticizing. First, you demonstrate carelessness that interferes with preparations for sacred ceremonies. Then you offer assurances as if your opinion about your own conduct matters more than my observations about your failures. Now you claim to mean no disrespect, while showing exactly the kind of presumption that proves you don't understand your place in this pack's hierarchy. Each accusation built upon the previous one, creating narrative of escalating defiance that justified increasingly severe response regardless of Naira's actual intentions or conduct. The audience of pack members who had gathered to observe the exchange showed expressions ranging from uncomfortable sympathy to eager anticipation of correction they believed was overdue. Your Highness, I truly apologize for any misunderstanding. I accept complete responsibility for the accident and any inconvenience it caused. Accept responsibility? Prince Riven's voice carried across the arena with volume that ensured his words reached everyone present. Do you imagine that accepting responsibility somehow negates the need for consequences? That apologizing erases disrespect and carelessness that could have interfered with ceremonies that connect us to our most sacred traditions? Naira found herself trapped in a situation where every response seemed to validate accusations she couldn't effectively counter without appearing to argue with royal authority. Her training in appropriate Omega behavior emphasized submission and deference as tools for survival, but those tools seemed inadequate for addressing hostility that had escalated beyond simple correction into something approaching personal attack. No, Your Highness. I understand that consequences are appropriate when service falls short of expected standards. Good. At least you understand that much. Prince Riven's expression shifted to satisfaction as he prepared to deliver correction that would demonstrate royal authority while providing entertainment for pack members who enjoyed witnessing hierarchical enforcement that confirmed their own superior positions relative to those being corrected. But what happened next transcended every expectation about how such confrontations were supposed to conclude. Prince Riven drew back his hand and delivered blow that was meant to send message about consequences, while providing physical reminder of the power differential that made resistance not just futile, but unthinkable. The strike was calculated to cause pain and humiliation without lasting injury, demonstrating royal prerogative to correct inappropriate behavior through methods that would be remembered by everyone present. The blow never landed. Instead, Prince Riven found his wrist caught in grip that stopped his attack with precision that spoke of training no Omega should have possessed. His hand was redirected with movement so smooth and controlled that observers later struggled to describe exactly what they had witnessed, though the result was unmistakable. Naira Vale had not only blocked the prince's strike, but had somehow reversed their positions so that he was off balance while she maintained perfect stability, despite being significantly smaller and supposedly weaker than her opponent. The reversal lasted perhaps 2 seconds, long enough for everyone present to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented, but not long enough for rational analysis of implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about power, capability, and the natural order that governed their society. Then, as quickly as she had demonstrated capabilities that shouldn't exist, Naira released Prince Riven's wrist and stepped back with expression that suggested she was as shocked as everyone else by what had just occurred. "Forgive me, Your Highness," she said in voice that trembled with what might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely. I didn't mean to. but her words were lost in silence that had fallen over the arena like physical weight, pressing against everyone present as they struggled to process evidence that contradicted everything they believed about Omega limitations and royal invulnerability. Prince Riven stood frozen, staring at his wrist where the sensation of controlled power still lingered like echo of contact with force that had been restrained, rather than fully unleashed. Behind him, Lady Cassandra's expression cycled through shock, disbelief, and growing fury as implications began to penetrate initial confusion. And throughout the arena, pack members who had expected to witness routine demonstration of hierarchical authority found themselves confronting questions about whether their most basic assumptions about strength and weakness, dominance and submission, power and helplessness might be far more complicated than they had ever imagined possible. The Omega who had apologized for accidentally bumping into the prince had just demonstrated capabilities that suggested she could have avoided that collision entirely if she had chosen to do so. More disturbing still, her reflexive defensive response had been so precisely controlled that Prince Riven remained unharmed, despite being completely helpless to prevent whatever she might have chosen to do during those 2 seconds when their positions had been reversed. Nyra Vale stood in the center of gathering attention with expression that suggested she understood her carefully constructed world had just collapsed around her, taking with it any hope of continued anonymity or safety within the pack structure that had provided protection through obscurity. The secret she had guarded for 20 years had been exposed in moments of reflexive response to threat she could have absorbed without resistance, if survival had mattered more than instincts that had been trained into her very bones by teachers whose lessons she had apparently never truly forgotten. And as shock began to transform into questions that would demand answers she wasn't prepared to provide, Nyra realized that the collision in the arena had been just the beginning of confrontation that would either destroy her entirely or reveal truths that would force the entire pack to reconsider their understanding of what was possible within their carefully ordered world. The autumn trials were about to become much more significant than anyone had anticipated. The silence that followed Nyra's defensive display stretched across the arena like the calm before a hurricane, pregnant with implications that no one present seemed equipped to process or address through conventional understanding of pack hierarchy and Omega limitations. Prince Riven remained motionless, his hand still extended in the position from which his strike had been intercepted with precision that defied everything he had been taught about the natural distribution of power within their society. But the paralysis couldn't last indefinitely. As seconds accumulated into moments that felt like hours, reality began to reassert itself through questions that demanded immediate answers, regardless of whether those answers aligned with comfortable assumptions about the way their world was supposed to function. "What?" Prince Riven said with voice that struggled to maintain royal authority while processing evidence that challenged fundamental beliefs about his own invulnerability. "Was that?" The question was directed at Nyra, though her response would be heard by everyone present, and would likely determine whether the incident could be contained through explanation, or would escalate into crisis that threatened established power structures throughout the pack. "Your Highness, I'm not certain," Nyra replied, with carefully controlled voice that betrayed none of the panic she was undoubtedly experiencing, as she recognized that her protective anonymity had been shattered beyond repair. "I reacted instinctively when I perceived threat. I didn't intend to demonstrate disrespect for your authority." "Instinctively," Prince Riven repeated, with tone that suggested the word carried significance beyond its obvious meaning. "You reacted instinctively to block strike that you somehow anticipated despite having no warning of its approach. And your instincts included combat training that enabled you to redirect royal attack with techniques that suggest formal instruction in methods designed to counter supernatural strength and speed." The analysis was accurate and damaging, revealing that Prince Riven possessed sufficient knowledge about combat techniques to recognize that what he had experienced wasn't luck or accident, but demonstration of capabilities that required extensive training by instructors who understood how to teach resistance to supernatural opponents. "Your Highness, I have no formal combat training. Whatever occurred must have been fortunate positioning rather than deliberate technique." "Fortunate positioning," Lady Cassandra interjected, with voice that cut through diplomatic evasion like blade through silk. She had moved closer during the exchange, and now stood where she could observe Nyra's reactions with intensity that suggested she was evaluating every word and gesture for signs of deception or concealed information. "Yes, my lady. I was fortunate that my movement happened to interfere with His Highness's intended action in ways that prevented contact." And this fortunate movement included gripping the prince's wrist with sufficient force to stop supernatural strength, while simultaneously repositioning yourself to maintain perfect balance despite being significantly smaller than your opponent. The detailed description made clear that Lady Cassandra had observed the exchange with tactical awareness that recognized specific techniques rather than simply witnessing unexpected outcome. Her questions weren't seeking clarification, but were designed to expose inconsistencies in Nira's explanation that would justify more intensive investigation of capabilities that threaten pack security if they remained unexplained. My lady, I can only describe what I experienced, which was reflexive response to perceived danger. I'm not qualified to analyze the technical aspects of whatever occurred. No, Lady Cassandra agreed with satisfaction. That suggested Nira's response had provided exactly the opening she had been seeking. You're not qualified to analyze technical aspects, but someone else clearly was qualified to train you in those techniques, and that someone possessed knowledge about combat methods designed specifically to counter Lycan advantages in strength, speed, and supernatural awareness. The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke, suggesting not just unauthorized training, but potential treason through association with enemies who had developed combat techniques specifically to neutralize Lycan military advantages. The implications extended beyond individual misconduct to questions about whether Nira's presence in the pack represented ongoing security threat that had been concealed through carefully constructed false identity. My lady, I have no knowledge of such training or association with anyone who possessed such capabilities. Whatever techniques you believe you observed must be the result of misinterpretation of accidental movements. Captain Valdris, Lady Cassandra called, without taking her attention from Nira's face. Your assessment of the defensive techniques just demonstrated. A scarred veteran whose reputation for tactical analysis was matched only by his loyalty to the royal family, approached with expression that suggested he had been studying the exchange with professional interest rather than casual curiosity. My lady, the techniques displayed were consistent with Shadowbane combat forms developed during the rebellion 20 years ago for use by human insurgents fighting against Lycan military forces, he reported with matter-of-fact precision that transformed theoretical suspicion into documented threat assessment. Specifically, the wrist control and balance manipulation methods designed to exploit Lycan overconfidence in physical superiority while redirecting supernatural strength against itself. The identification sent ripples of shock through the growing crowd as pack members processed information that connected Nira's capabilities to historical enemies whose rebellion had nearly succeeded in overthrowing the current royal family through combination of tactical innovation and insider knowledge about Lycan weaknesses. And such techniques could only be learned through direct instruction from survivors of that rebellion or their trained associates. Correct, my lady. The Shadowbane forms were never documented in writing and required personal instruction from masters who had developed them through combat experience against Lycan opponents. Knowledge of these techniques among current population would indicate either direct connection to rebellion survivors or ongoing conspiracy involving enemies who have maintained training capabilities despite official suppression of their organization. Each word made Nira's position more precarious, while simultaneously revealing information about her background that she had apparently hoped would remain concealed permanently. The technical analysis provided by military authority would be difficult to counter through claims of innocence or accident, while the historical context transformed her defensive response into evidence of potential treason. Your Highness, Prince Riven said with voice that had recovered authority, as shock transformed into anger at having been made to appear vulnerable before his subjects. It appears we have security concern that requires immediate investigation and resolution. Indeed, came a new voice that made everyone present straighten with automatic deference. King Aldrich Blackmore had arrived with presence that seemed to bend reality around his passage. His attention focused immediately on the situation that had drawn pack leadership into crisis management during what should have been ceremonial celebration. Father, Prince Riven said with relief at having royal authority available to address complications that had escalated beyond his ability to control through conventional means. This Omega has demonstrated combat capabilities that Captain Valdris identifies as enemy techniques developed during the rebellion. The security implications require immediate action. King Aldrich studied Nira with intensity that felt almost physical, his supernatural senses apparently analyzing information that wasn't available to normal observation, while his expression remained carefully neutral, despite the obvious significance of what he was discovering. Interesting, he said after several moments of evaluation that left Naira feeling exposed and vulnerable under scrutiny that seemed to penetrate every secret she had tried to protect. Captain Valdris, your assessment appears accurate. The techniques observed do indeed correspond to Shadowbane combat forms, though the precision of their execution suggests instruction by someone with master-level expertise, rather than casual familiarity with basic concepts. Your Majesty, what action should be taken regarding potential security threat represented by undisclosed enemy training among pack population? Standard protocol would require immediate detention for intensive interrogation regarding the source of such training and potential ongoing connections to enemy organizations, King Aldrich replied with tone that suggested he was reciting established procedures while considering alternatives that might serve different purposes. However, he continued with emphasis that made clear his next words would represent departure from standard approaches, the current situation presents unique circumstances that may require modified response. Your Majesty? Prince Riven's expression suggested confusion about why circumstances would justify anything other than immediate enforcement of security protocols designed to protect pack interests against enemy infiltration. The circumstances, my son, include the fact that this Omega just demonstrated defensive capabilities that successfully countered your attack without causing injury or permanent humiliation, despite possessing techniques that could have been used to cause significant harm if that had been her intention. The observation forced everyone present to reconsider what they had witnessed through lens that emphasized restraint rather than aggression, protection rather than attack, controlled response rather than unleashed capability. Naira's defensive actions had indeed been precisely calibrated to prevent harm, while demonstrating competence, suggesting priorities that might not align with enemy infiltration objectives. Additionally, King Aldrich continued with attention, that remained focused on Naira's reactions to information she was hearing about herself. The precision required to execute such techniques without causing injury suggests training that emphasized protection of opponents, rather than their destruction. Such priorities would be unusual for enemy combatants whose objectives typically involve causing maximum damage rather than minimizing harm. Your Majesty, Lady Cassandra interjected with tone that suggested disagreement with analysis that minimized security concerns. Regardless of her apparent restraint, unauthorized possession of enemy combat techniques represents clear violation of pack security that demands investigation according to established protocols. True, King Aldrich acknowledged with gesture that indicated he wasn't dismissing legitimate security concerns, but was placing them within broader context that might affect appropriate response. But established protocols assume that security violations represent hostile intent rather than other possibilities. What other possibilities, Your Majesty? The possibility that knowledge of Shadowbane techniques was acquired for defensive purposes rather than offensive objectives. The possibility that such knowledge represents insurance against future enemy action, rather than preparation for current enemy collaboration. The possibility that we are confronting protective capabilities, rather than hostile intentions. Each possibility required pack leadership to consider interpretations of Nira's capabilities that didn't automatically assume the worst about her motivations or loyalties, though the practical implications of those possibilities remained unclear, despite their theoretical validity. Your Majesty, Captain Valdris said with tone that suggested professional obligation to address concerns that transcended political considerations. Regardless of motivations, unauthorized possession of enemy techniques creates potential for future hostile action that security protocols are designed to prevent through early intervention. Understood. But, Captain, consider the broader tactical implications of what we have observed today. If this Omega possesses master-level knowledge of Shadowbane techniques, she also possesses intelligence regarding enemy capabilities that could prove invaluable for developing countermeasures against future threats. The strategic reframing transformed Naira's capabilities from pure security threat into potential intelligence asset, whose knowledge might serve pack interests if properly managed through cooperation rather than suppression through interrogation. Furthermore, King Aldrich added with slight smile that suggested he found irony in circumstances that had revealed information through accident rather than investigation. Her demonstration of restraint while under direct physical threat suggests psychological profile more consistent with protective orientation than aggressive intent. Your Majesty, Prince Riven interrupted with frustration that seemed to stem from having his authority questioned through analysis that minimized the significance of being blocked by someone who should have been incapable of resistance. Are you suggesting that security protocols should be abandoned? Because this Omega showed restraint while demonstrating capabilities she should never have said. I'm suggesting, my son, that effective leadership requires adapting responses to serve pack interests rather than simply following predetermined procedures that may not address unique circumstances appropriately. The gentle correction carried weight that made clear King Aldrich's patience with conventional thinking had limits when faced with situations that demanded innovation rather than adherence to established protocols. What specific response do you recommend, Your Majesty? Lady Cassandra asked with tone that suggested she was prepared to implement royal decisions, regardless of whether they aligned with her personal preferences about appropriate security measures. I recommend immediate private consultation with the individual in question to determine the source of her capabilities and assess whether those capabilities represent threat or opportunity for pack security interests. And if consultation reveals hostile intent or ongoing enemy connections, then we implement standard security protocols with full force. But if consultation reveals circumstances that suggest alternative interpretations, we explore those alternatives with attention to potential benefits as well as risks. The balanced approach acknowledged legitimate security concerns, while avoiding premature commitment to responses that might waste valuable opportunities for intelligence gathering or alliance building that could serve long-term pack interests. Your Majesty, Nira said quietly, speaking for the first time since the royal family had taken control of the situation, I'm prepared to cooperate fully with whatever investigation you deem appropriate, with understanding that my primary loyalty is to pack security rather than personal protection. Understood. However, cooperation will be more productive if conducted through private consultation rather than public interrogation that might compromise sensitive information or create unnecessary political complications. The suggestion that royal attention to her situation had political dimensions beyond immediate security concerns added new complexity to circumstances that had already escalated beyond anything Nira could have anticipated when she had reflexively defended herself against Prince Riven's attack. Captain Valdris, King Aldrich commanded with authority that transformed discussion into action, arrange private meeting in the secured consultation chamber within 1 hour. Standard confidentiality protocols apply. Understood, Your Majesty. Lady Cassandra, ensure that today's incident is treated as administrative matter, requiring investigation rather than public security crisis, requiring immediate pack-wide alerts. Discretion serves our interests better than panic at this stage. Of course, Your Majesty. Prince Riven, you will accompany me to the private consultation to provide your perspective on the incident and to continue your education regarding leadership decisions that balance multiple considerations rather than simply responding to initial emotional reactions. The instruction carried clear criticism of Prince Riven's handling of the original confrontation, while providing opportunity for him to observe more sophisticated approach to crisis management that might serve his future royal responsibilities. But as the royal family and their advisors began organizing private investigation that would determine Nira's fate, while protecting pack interests from potential complications, the Omega, who had accidentally exposed capabilities that threatened her survival, recognized that the most dangerous part of her ordeal was still approaching. The collision in the arena had revealed techniques that proved her connection to enemies who had once threatened the royal family's survival. The private consultation that would follow would force her to choose between maintaining deceptions that were no longer sustainable and revealing truths that might be even more dangerous than the accusations she was already facing. Because Nira Vale was not who she appeared to be, and the knowledge she possessed about Shadowbane techniques was just the beginning of secrets that could either serve the pack's interests or destroy their sense of security entirely. As she prepared for interrogation, that would determine whether she lived or died based on explanations she gave about training she had hoped never to reveal, Nira realized that survival would require choices that would transform her from anonymous Omega into someone whose very existence would reshape power relationships throughout the pack. The question was whether the truth about her background would prove more dangerous than the lies that had protected her for 20 years, and whether King Aldrich's apparent willingness to consider alternatives to standard security protocols represented genuine opportunity or sophisticated trap designed to expose information that could never be revealed safely. The private consultation would provide answers to questions that would determine not just her individual fate, but potentially the future stability of the entire pack structure that had sustained their society for centuries. and looking at Prince Riven's expression as he prepared to participate in investigation of the Omega, who had humiliated him before his subjects, Nyra recognized that her survival would require not just satisfying the king's security concerns, but somehow addressing the wounded pride of an heir whose own position might be threatened by revelations about her true capabilities and background. The collision had been accidental. Everything that followed would be deliberate, calculated, and potentially fatal for someone whose secrets had been exposed at exactly the wrong moment, to exactly the wrong people, under circumstances that made denial impossible and escape unlikely. The Omega, who had spent 20 years hiding among her enemies, was about to discover whether honesty or continued deception offered better prospects for surviving revelation, that her very existence represented challenge to everything the royal family believed about their own security and the loyalty of those they governed. The secured consultation chamber deep within Blackridge Keep had been designed for conversations that required absolute privacy and complete control. Its stone walls inscribed with ancient symbols that prevented supernatural eavesdropping, while its single entrance could be monitored by guards whose loyalty to the royal family had been tested through generations of service. The room's austere furnishing, a single table, 4 chairs, and illumination provided by crystals that responded to supernatural energy rather than flame, emphasized function over comfort, creating atmosphere that encouraged honesty through subtle psychological pressure. Nyra sat with posture that balanced respectful attention with readiness for movement, her hands folded carefully in her lap, while her awareness tracked every sound and shadow that might provide warning of changing circumstances. The hour between public revelation and private interrogation had been filled with escort by silent guards, who treated her with professional courtesy that suggested they had received specific instructions about appropriate conduct toward someone whose status remained under evaluation. King Aldrich entered with presence that seemed to fill the chamber despite its considerable size, followed immediately by Prince Riven, whose expression suggested he was still processing emotions ranging from wounded pride to confused fascination with the Omega, who had demonstrated capabilities that challenged his understanding of natural hierarchies. Lady Cassandra and Captain Valdris completed the group that would determine whether Nyra's explanations justified continued survival or warranted implementation of security measures that would eliminate perceived threats permanently. "Before we begin formal questioning," King Aldrich said, as he settled into the chair across from Nyra, with movements that emphasized controlled power rather than casual comfort, "I want to establish parameters for this discussion that serve everyone's interests rather than simply following interrogation protocols designed for hostile enemy agents." "Your Majesty?" Prince Riven's tone suggested uncertainty about why standard procedures required modification when addressing someone who had already demonstrated possession of enemy combat techniques. "The parameters, my son, recognize that effective information gathering requires creating an environment where honest communication serves the subject's interests, as well as our security requirements. Threats and intimidation may produce immediate compliance, but they rarely generate reliable intelligence about complex situations that require nuanced understanding." The explanation emphasized sophisticated approach to investigation that prioritized accuracy over expediency, while acknowledging that Nyra's cooperation would be more valuable than her submission if circumstances proved more complicated than initial assumptions suggested. Additionally, King Aldrich continued with attention that remained focused on Nyra's reactions to information she was receiving about royal intentions. "Preliminary analysis suggests that we may be confronting protective capabilities rather than hostile preparations, which would require fundamentally different response strategies than those designed for enemy infiltration scenarios." Your Majesty," Nyra said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the secured chamber, "I appreciate your willingness to consider alternative interpretations of this morning's incident, though I understand that my explanations must be sufficient to address legitimate security concerns, regardless of your initial impressions." "Understood. Now, shall we begin with basic information that provides context for more specific questions about your background and training?" "Of course, Your Majesty. Your full name and family history as you understand them." "Nyra Vale, Your Majesty. Orphaned at age 7 when my parents died in what I was told was territorial dispute in the border regions. Raised subsequently by foster families within the pack, who provided basic care and education appropriate for Omega development." The information was delivered with careful precision that suggested she had prepared for questions about her background, while acknowledging that verification of such details would be difficult, given the passage of time and the nature of records keeping in frontier areas, and your understanding of your parents' roles within pack structure? Low-ranking pack members whose specific duties were never explained to me in detail, Your Majesty. My foster families discouraged discussion of my background, claiming such conversations would be painful given the circumstances of my loss. I see. Captain Valdris, what information do our records contain regarding territorial disputes in border regions 20 years ago that might have resulted in the casualties described? Your Majesty, border conflicts during that period were extensive and poorly documented due to the chaos surrounding the rebellion. Multiple families were displaced or lost during fighting that involved both internal insurgency and external invasion attempts. Verification of specific casualties would require accessing records that may no longer exist or may have been deliberately destroyed to protect survivors from retaliation. The military assessment provided context that made Naira's background story plausible, while simultaneously acknowledging that verification would be nearly impossible through conventional investigation methods. And regarding the Shadowbane techniques demonstrated this morning, King Aldrich continued with shift in focus that moved from historical background to immediate security concerns. What explanation do you offer for possessing knowledge that should have died with the rebellion's defeat? The question represented the core challenge that Naira's survival depended upon addressing satisfactorily. Her response would need to acknowledge demonstrated capabilities while providing explanation that served pack security interests rather than suggesting ongoing enemy connections. Your Majesty, my training in defensive techniques began during my childhood with foster families who were concerned about my survival prospects as Omega without family protection. The specific techniques I demonstrated were taught as methods for avoiding serious injury during confrontations with pack members, whose authority I couldn't challenge directly. You're suggesting that Shadowbane combat forms were taught as self-defense training for vulnerable Omega rather than as preparation for hostile action against pack leadership? Yes, Your Majesty. My instructors emphasized that the techniques should only be used to prevent harm rather than to cause injury, and only when no alternative existed for avoiding dangerous situations. The explanation reframed her capabilities as protective measures rather than offensive weapons, while acknowledging that such protection had been considered necessary due to her vulnerable position within pack hierarchy. And these instructors? Prince Riven interjected with tone that suggested skepticism about convenient explanations that minimize security threats. Were they members of our pack who happened to possess knowledge of enemy techniques? Or were they outsiders whose presence would have required authorization that should be documented in our security records? Your Highness, my instructors were pack members whose own backgrounds included experiences during the border conflicts. They taught defensive techniques without providing detailed explanation of their origins or theoretical foundations. Pack members whose identities you could provide for verification of your claims? Naira hesitated for the first time since questioning had begun, her expression suggesting internal conflict between honesty and loyalty to people who had provided protection during her vulnerable childhood. Your Highness, my primary instructor died several years ago from natural causes. The others? I would prefer not to identify without their consent, as such identification might create complications for people who are trying to help, rather than harm pack interests. You would prefer, Prince Riven repeated with emphasis that suggested her preferences were irrelevant compared to security requirements, not to provide information that would allow verification of explanations about unauthorized enemy training within our pack structure? Your Highness, I'm willing to provide whatever information serves pack security, but I hope such information can be gathered in ways that don't unnecessarily endanger people whose only crime was showing kindness to orphaned child. The appeal to consideration for innocent parties was strategically sound while demonstrating loyalty to people who had shaped her development, though it also suggested that complete cooperation might require guarantees about protection for others that royal authority might not be prepared to provide. Lady Cassandra, King Aldrich said, with tone that indicated shift toward practical evaluation of information that had been provided. Your assessment of explanations offered regarding background and training? Your Majesty, the explanations are internally consistent and acknowledge demonstrated capabilities, while providing plausible context that minimizes security implications. However, verification would require additional investigation that might prove challenging given the circumstances described. And your recommendation regarding appropriate response based on current information? Cautious acceptance pending verification, Your Majesty, with ongoing monitoring to ensure that protective capabilities remain oriented toward defensive rather than offensive applications. The measured response acknowledged legitimate security concerns while avoiding premature commitment to responses that might waste valuable opportunities for intelligence gathering or alliance building. Captain Valdris, your professional assessment? Your Majesty. The technical precision demonstrated suggests instruction by individuals with master-level expertise rather than casual familiarity with basic concepts. Such instruction would have required significant time investment and personal commitment that seems unlikely for simple self-defense training. Implications? Either the subject received more extensive training than she has acknowledged, or her instructors possessed capabilities that exceeded what would be expected from pack members with incidental exposure to enemy techniques during border conflicts. The military analysis suggested gaps in Naira's explanations that would require additional investigation before definitive conclusions could be reached about security implications of her capabilities. Your Majesty, Naira said carefully, recognizing that incomplete honesty was creating more problems than it was solving. I may have understated the extent of my training in an attempt to minimize concerns about security implications. If more detailed explanation would serve pack interests better than protective discretion, I'm prepared to provide such explanation. More detailed explanation would indeed be helpful. King Aldrich replied with tone that suggested appreciation for her recognition that circumstances required greater honesty than initial caution had provided. What additional information can you share about the nature and extent of your training? Your Majesty, my instruction in defensive techniques was more systematic and extensive than typical self-defense training. My primary instructor possessed exceptional expertise and devoted considerable time to ensuring that I could protect myself against threats that might target Omega without family protection. And the source of this instructor's exceptional expertise? Direct experience fighting against Lycan opponents during the rebellion, Your Majesty. He was a survivor of forces that had developed techniques specifically to counter supernatural advantages. The admission sent tension through the chamber, as everyone present processed implications of Naira having been trained by someone with direct knowledge of enemy tactics developed during the only serious threat the current royal family had faced to their continued survival. A survivor, Prince Riven said, with voice that struggled to maintain control while processing information that suggested much more serious security implications than protective self-defense training, of enemy forces that attempted to overthrow our government and assassinate our family. Yes, Your Highness, though his motivations for training me were protective rather than hostile. He believed that knowledge of defensive techniques was necessary for my survival in an environment where physical vulnerability could prove fatal. And you expect us to accept that enemy combatant who possessed knowledge capable of threatening royal security chose to use that knowledge to protect Omega Child rather than to prepare ongoing resistance against the government that had defeated his cause. The skepticism was reasonable and reflected legitimate concerns about whether Naira's explanations adequately addressed security implications of her connection to rebellion survivors whose loyalties might remain questionable despite apparent peaceful integration into pack society. Your Highness, I can only describe what I experienced, which was patient instruction focused entirely on survival techniques rather than offensive capabilities. My instructor's priorities seem to emphasize avoiding conflict rather than preparing for it. Captain Valdris, King Aldrich said with tone that indicated need for professional analysis of information that had transformed initial security concerns into more complex evaluation of historical connections and current loyalties. What assessment do you offer regarding former enemy combatants who might have survived integration into pack society? Your Majesty, post-rebellion integration efforts were designed to provide opportunities for former enemies to demonstrate loyalty through productive contribution to pack society. Some survivors did successfully integrate and became valued pack members whose expertise contributed to our defensive capabilities. And the possibility that such integration included sharing tactical knowledge with pack members who might benefit from enhanced protective capabilities? Theoretically possible, Your Majesty, though such sharing would have required careful evaluation to ensure that knowledge transfer served pack interests rather than potentially compromising our security through creation of internal capabilities that could be turned against us. Yet the techniques demonstrated this morning suggest exactly such knowledge. Transfer occurred without official oversight or approval. Yes, Your Majesty, which raises questions about whether such transfer represented unauthorized security risk or defensive preparation that wasn't properly documented through official channels. The military analysis acknowledged that Nira's situation existed in gray area between legitimate security concern and potentially beneficial capability development that had occurred outside normal oversight mechanisms. "Your Majesty," Nyra said, with voice that carried new determination, as she recognized that partial honesty was creating more suspicion than complete disclosure might generate. "If full explanation of my background would serve pack security better than continued careful discretion, I'm prepared to provide such explanation, despite potential personal consequences." "Full explanation would indeed be helpful," King Aldrich replied with a tension that suggested he had been waiting for her to reach decision about complete honesty, rather than forcing such disclosure through interrogation pressure. "What additional information can you provide?" "Your Majesty, my instructor was not simply rebellion survivor who had integrated into pack society. He was my grandfather, who had been presumed dead along with other family members during fighting that destroyed our original home." The revelation transformed every aspect of the situation, as implications cascaded through understanding that had been based on assumptions about Nyra's background that were apparently incomplete or incorrect. "Your grandfather," Prince Riven said with voice that suggested he was beginning to understand that Nyra's capabilities represented family heritage rather than enemy infiltration. "And your family's original status before displacement during border conflicts?" "Your Highness, my family held minor territorial position in border regions where our responsibilities included defensive coordination against external threats that required specialized knowledge about counter-supernatural tactics. Specialized knowledge that included development of techniques later employed by rebellion forces." "Yes, Your Highness. Though originally such techniques were developed for defending pack territories rather than attacking pack leadership. The rebellion appropriated defensive methods and adapted them for offensive purposes that my family had never intended or supported. The explanation provided context that reframed Shadowbane techniques from pure enemy development to adaptation of legitimate defensive innovation that had been corrupted by rebel forces for purposes beyond their original design. And your grandfather's survival and subsequent training of his granddaughter represented attempt to preserve family knowledge for legitimate defensive purposes." "Yes, Your Majesty. He believed that knowledge of defensive techniques was our family's responsibility and legacy, even if circumstances had forced us to live under assumed identities rather than claiming our original status." "Lady Cassandra," King Aldrich said, with tone that indicated need for evaluation of revelations that had transformed security investigation into genealogical research with significant political implications. "What records do we maintain regarding minor territorial families displaced during border conflicts?" "Your Majesty, record-keeping during that period was disrupted by ongoing conflicts, but archives might contain information about families whose status was affected by territorial changes or enemy action. Investigate such records with attention to identifying families whose defensive responsibilities might have included development of counter-supernatural techniques. Priority should be given to determining whether any such families were mistakenly presumed extinct when members actually survived displacement." "Understood, Your Majesty." "Captain Valdris, what assessment do you offer regarding possibility that Shadowbane techniques originated as legitimate pack defensive innovation rather than pure enemy development?" Your Majesty, technical analysis suggests sophisticated understanding of Lycan physiology and psychology that would be more consistent with internal development by pack members than external research by enemies lacking detailed knowledge of our capabilities. Implications for current security evaluation? If techniques originated as legitimate defensive development, then knowledge preservation through family instruction represents continuity of pack defensive capabilities rather than enemy infiltration or hostile preparation. The military assessment provided framework for reinterpreting Nira's capabilities as recovered rather than acquired knowledge, though verification would still require investigation of historical records and genealogical research. "Your Majesty," Nyra said with voice that carried relief at having finally shared complete truth about her background, "I understand that my explanations require verification before definitive conclusions can be reached, but I hope that full disclosure demonstrates commitment to pack security rather than threat to pack interests." "It does," King Aldrich replied, with tone that suggested his evaluation of her situation had shifted significantly, based on information that provided legitimate context for capabilities that had initially appeared threatening. "However, Complete resolution of security concerns will require verification of genealogical claims and historical research that may take considerable time to complete thoroughly. What interim arrangements do you recommend, Your Majesty? Prince Riven asked, with expression that suggested his own assessment of Naira had evolved through revelations that challenged his initial assumptions about Omega limitations and enemy connections. Interim arrangements that acknowledge demonstrated capabilities, while providing opportunity for those capabilities to serve pack interests, rather than remaining concealed through protective anonymity. The king's response suggested that Naira's situation would change dramatically, regardless of final verification results, though the specific nature of those changes remained to be determined through discussions that would balance security concerns with recognition of valuable capabilities. Your Majesty, what specific arrangements would serve pack interests while addressing legitimate security requirements? Arrangements that include formal recognition of defensive capabilities, structured training opportunities that develop those capabilities for pack service, and monitoring that ensures continued loyalty while providing protection against potential threats from external enemies who might target someone with knowledge of techniques they developed. Each element suggested comprehensive approach to managing situation that treated Naira as asset requiring protection, rather than threat requiring containment, though implementation would require careful planning to avoid creating new security vulnerabilities while maximizing potential benefits. And regarding my current status within pack hierarchy? No. Your current status will require adjustment to reflect capabilities that exceed typical Omega limitations, while acknowledging genealogical heritage that may justify elevated position, once verification confirms family background claims. The prospect of status elevation based on demonstrated capabilities and potential noble heritage represented transformation that Naira had never anticipated, despite years of concealing abilities that might have justified such recognition if circumstances had been different. But as discussions continued regarding practical implementation of changes that would reshape her role within pack society while serving broader security interests, movement from outside the consultation chamber indicated that private investigation was about to become public knowledge through developments that none of the participants had anticipated. Your Majesty, came an urgent voice from beyond the secured door. Immediate consultation required regarding external threats that may be connected to this morning's incident. The interruption suggested that Naira's revelation of capabilities had attracted attention from sources outside the pack, whose interest in her background might represent security concerns that transcended internal political considerations. Enter, King Aldrich commanded with tone that indicated readiness to address new complications, regardless of their complexity or timing. The guard who entered carried intelligence reports that would transform internal security evaluation into crisis management, requiring immediate action to protect pack interests against threats that had been monitoring their activities with attention that suggested ongoing surveillance rather than casual observation. Your Majesty, Border Scouts report movement of organized forces whose positioning suggests advanced knowledge of current personnel changes within pack leadership structure. Intelligence indicates external enemies may have been waiting for developments that exposed information about defensive capabilities they have been seeking to counter or acquire. The report transformed Naira's situation from internal security matter into potential target for external enemies, whose interest in her capabilities represented immediate threat, requiring protective response, rather than continued investigation. Assessment of threat levels and timeline for potential action? Unknown, Your Majesty, but positioning suggests preparation for immediate action rather than long-term surveillance. Recommend activation of enhanced security protocols with particular attention to protecting individuals whose recent exposure might have created targeting opportunities for enemy intelligence operations. The military assessment made clear that Naira's public demonstration of capabilities had created security vulnerabilities that extended beyond internal pack politics to external threats that might have been monitoring their territory for exactly such revelations. Prince Riven, King Aldrich commanded with authority that transformed consultation into crisis response. Coordinate immediate enhancement of personal security for all individuals whose exposure during this morning's incident might have created targeting opportunities. Understood, Father. Lady Cassandra, activate intelligence networks to determine source and scope of external surveillance that appears to have been monitoring our activities with concerning attention to detail. Immediately, Your Majesty. Captain Valdris, develop defensive scenarios that account for enemies whose interest in our internal capabilities suggests they may possess countermeasures or acquisition priorities that threaten pack security. Yes, Your Majesty. As pack leadership coordinated response to external threats that had transformed Naira's personal crisis into broader security emergency, the Omega, whose accidental revelation had triggered cascade of consequences, realized that her struggle for survival had evolved beyond individual concerns to pack-wide implications that would determine whether her capabilities served as protection or created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The collision in the arena had exposed secrets that attracted attention from multiple directions, creating a situation where her survival required not just satisfying royal security concerns, but protecting pack interests against external threats that viewed her knowledge as valuable acquisition target or dangerous capability requiring elimination. The private consultation had resolved questions about her loyalty and background, but the intelligence report suggested that larger challenges were approaching that would test whether her defensive capabilities and the pack's protective response would prove sufficient against enemies whose patience and planning suggested sophisticated understanding of both her value and her vulnerabilities. 6 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the advanced training grounds where elite pack warriors honed skills that had evolved far beyond traditional combat methods through integration of techniques that had once been considered enemy innovations. The transformation of Shadowbane defensive forms into legitimate pack defensive doctrine represented revolution in supernatural warfare that had attracted attention from allied territories seeking advantages against enemies whose own capabilities continued evolving beyond conventional tactical expectations. Naira moved among the training circles with authority that reflected both her proven expertise and her formally recognized status as Lady Naira Shadowmere, heir to family heritage that had been restored after genealogical research confirmed her grandfather's claims about their legitimate position within pack territorial hierarchy. The minor lordship that had been presumed extinct carried with it responsibilities for defensive innovation that had proven essential for addressing external threats that had indeed materialized following her public exposure. But her elevation from Omega to nobility represented only part of transformation that had reshaped multiple aspects of pack society through challenges that had tested everyone's assumptions about hierarchy, capability, and the distribution of power within their carefully ordered world. Lady Naira, came a familiar voice that still carried traces of the arrogance that had characterized their initial confrontation. Though months of working together had mellowed Prince Riven's attitude toward someone whose capabilities had initially threatened his sense of superiority, the new recruits are ready for evaluation of their progress in defensive techniques. Thank you, Your Highness. I'll assess their readiness for advancement to intermediate training levels. The formal courtesy between them had evolved into comfortable working relationship that balanced professional respect with personal connection, that had grown through shared challenges and mutual recognition of capabilities that complemented each other effectively. And regarding this afternoon's meeting with the Allied Territories' military advisors, preparation is complete for demonstrating integrated defensive techniques that incorporate both traditional Lycan methods and enhanced Shadowbane adaptations. The Alliance representatives should leave with clear understanding of advantages that cooperation between our territories can provide against enemies who continue developing countermeasures against conventional supernatural warfare. The diplomatic responsibilities that came with her elevated status had proven surprisingly compatible with her defensive expertise, creating opportunities for her to serve pack interests through education and alliance building that extended far beyond individual combat capabilities. As they discussed schedules that reflected her integration into pack leadership structure, while maintaining focus on defensive innovation that had become her primary contribution to pack security, movement at the training ground entrance drew their attention toward approaching figure whose presence always created mixture of professional respect and personal warmth. King Aldrich approached with expression that combined satisfaction at observing successful integration of capabilities that served pack interests with something that might have been paternal pride in developments that had exceeded his most optimistic expectations about how crisis management could transform potential threats into valuable assets. Lady Naira, Your Highness, he said, with tone that balanced formal acknowledgement of their positions with personal affection, developed through months of collaboration that had proven beneficial for everyone involved. I trust preparations for this afternoon's demonstration are proceeding satisfactorily? Yes, Your Majesty, Naira replied with confidence that reflected months of experience in presenting defensive innovations to audiences whose security decisions would be influenced by evidence of effectiveness rather than theoretical explanations. The integrated techniques should provide clear demonstration of advantages that alliance cooperation can offer against evolving threats. Excellent. And regarding the broader implications of such cooperation for pact security and territorial defense, the alliance framework provides foundation for information sharing that enhances everyone's defensive capabilities, while creating network of mutual support that makes individual territories much more difficult targets for enemies whose strategies depend upon isolating potential victims. Her analysis emphasized practical benefits that extended beyond immediate military advantages to long-term strategic security that would serve all allied territories through cooperative approaches that individual capabilities couldn't match. Prince Riven, your assessment of integration between traditional methods and enhanced defensive innovations? Father, the combination has proven more effective than either approach alone could provide. Traditional Lycan advantages in strength and speed complement enhanced defensive awareness and precision in ways that create capabilities that enemies struggle to counter effectively. And personal evaluation of working relationship with Lady Nyra? Prince Riven's expression shifted to something that suggested his answer involved considerations beyond purely professional assessment, though his response maintained appropriate formality despite obvious personal investment in collaborative partnership that had developed through months of shared challenges. Father, Lady Nyra's expertise and dedication have contributed to pact security in ways that exceed what traditional hierarchy assumptions would have predicted possible. Her elevation to noble status reflects not just genealogical heritage, but demonstrated value that serves pact interests through innovative approaches to persistent threats. Indeed, though I suspect your evaluation includes considerations beyond purely strategic assessment. The gentle observation carried knowing tone that suggested King Aldrich had been monitoring development of personal relationship alongside professional collaboration, though his expression indicated approval rather than concern about emotional connections that had grown through working partnership. Father, my respect for Lady Nyra's capabilities has evolved through experience that demonstrates the value of challenging conventional assumptions about worth and potential. And Lady Nyra, your perspective on collaborative partnership that has developed through months of working together on projects that serve pact security? Nyra felt heat rise to her cheeks as she realized that private feelings she had tried to keep separate from professional responsibilities were apparently more obvious than she had hoped, though the king's tone suggested his interest was supportive rather than critical. Your Majesty, Prince Riven's willingness to acknowledge capabilities that initial circumstances made difficult to appreciate has demonstrated leadership qualities that prioritize pact interests over personal pride. Such qualities suggest— She paused, recognizing that public discussion of personal feelings required careful navigation. Suggest compatibility that extends beyond immediate collaborative requirements. I see. And would such compatibility serve broader pact interests through formalization that strengthens alliance between family heritage and royal authority? The diplomatic question barely concealed suggestion that personal relationship might serve political objectives while providing foundation for continued cooperation that had proven beneficial for pact security and territorial defense. Your Majesty, Prince Riven said with determination that suggested he had been preparing for such conversation, despite uncertainty about appropriate timing. I would be honored if Lady Nyra would consider formal partnership that acknowledges both personal compatibility and strategic advantages that such alliance would provide for pact interests. The proposal was delivered with combination of personal sincerity and political awareness that reflected months of consideration about how emotional connection could serve broader objectives, while remaining true to feelings that had developed through shared challenges and mutual respect. Your Highness, Nyra replied with a smile that acknowledged both the personal invitation and its broader implications. Such partnership would serve interests that extend beyond individual preferences to include continued development of defensive capabilities and alliance relationships that protect everyone threatened by external enemies. Then you accept formal engagement that will be announced during this afternoon's alliance demonstration. I accept with understanding that such engagement represents commitment to continued innovation in service of pact security, as well as personal partnership that has proven effective through recent challenges. As they discussed arrangements that would transform their working relationship into formal alliance with implications for pact politics and territorial defense, the sound of approaching messengers indicated that external developments continued requiring attention from leadership responsible for coordinating response to threats that persisted despite successful integration of defensive innovation. S. Your Majesty, the senior messenger announced with professional urgency that suggested important rather than critical developments. Confirmation received that Allied territories have successfully implemented defensive modifications based on techniques demonstrated through recent cooperation. Enemy forces that had been massing for coordinated assault appear to have abandoned immediate offensive plans in favor of strategic withdrawal to reassess capabilities that no longer match their intelligence assumptions. The report confirmed that Naira's accidental revelation of capabilities had ultimately served PAC security through defensive innovations that had frustrated enemy plans, while strengthening alliance relationships that provided mutual protection against threats that individual territories couldn't counter effectively. Assessment of long-term implications for territorial security and alliance stability? Positive, Your Majesty. The cooperation framework established through defensive technique sharing has created foundation for continued collaboration that makes all participating territories more difficult targets, while providing early warning network that enhances preparation time for addressing new threats. Excellent. Lady Naira, it appears that your grandfather's preservation of family knowledge has served PAC interests in ways that extend far beyond immediate defensive applications. Yes, Your Majesty. Though I hope continued development of such knowledge serves protective purposes rather than offensive applications that could compromise the defensive priorities that motivated its original creation. Understood. The focus will remain on protection rather than aggression, though effective protection sometimes requires capabilities that enemies respect, rather than dismiss as inadequate to counter their own innovations. As conversations continued regarding implementation of defensive strategies that had emerged from crisis management that began with accidental revelation in arena confrontation, Naira reflected on transformation that had reshaped not just her individual circumstances but broader PAC society through challenges that had tested everyone's assumptions about capability, worth, and the distribution of power within their social structure. The Omega who had hidden capabilities to survive among those who would have rejected such abilities had become noble lady, whose expertise served PAC security, while her partnership with Royal Heir provided foundation for continued innovation that protected innocent lives against enemies whose own evolution demanded constant adaptation. The collision that had exposed secrets she had protected for 20 years had ultimately revealed that survival required not concealment, but integration of capabilities that served everyone's interests when applied through wisdom, rather than suppression through fear. Looking toward training grounds where new recruits learned defensive techniques that balanced traditional Lycan advantages with enhanced awareness that challenged conventional limitations, she recognized that her greatest victory hadn't been surviving revelation of dangerous capabilities, but discovering that such capabilities could serve purposes that extended far beyond individual protection to collective security that benefited everyone threatened by enemies whose sophistication required equally sophisticated responses. Her grandfather's preservation of family knowledge had indeed served defensive purposes, creating foundation for innovations that protected not just PAC territories, but allied lands whose cooperation multiplied everyone's security through shared capability development that individual efforts could never have achieved. The prince who had struck her in anger had become partner whose recognition of her worth served broader alliance objectives, while their personal connection provided foundation for continued collaboration that would face future challenges through combined capabilities that exceeded what either could accomplish alone. The arena confrontation had ended within minutes, but its consequences continued shaping developments that served protective purposes. The original Shadowbane defensive forms had been designed to achieve, demonstrating that knowledge preserved through courage could ultimately serve justice through application that honored its creators' intentions rather than corrupting their innovations through RPOs they had never supported. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.